in talking about the atmosphere, it's important to know what it's made of so we understand how it works. So in the next few slides, you'll understand what type of elements and compounds and mixtures that you'll see involved in the atmosphere to help either absorb the sun's rays, or it would allow it to pass through so we feel it down here on Earth. This picture shows a graph to let you know what the major gases are that make up the atmosphere. And you can see the biggest part of this pie graph on the left is nitrogen with about 78%. And then oxygen takes up almost the rest of that pie chart with close to 21%, making up the entire atmosphere. And then you have argon, almost 1%. And then trace gases means that there's a very, very, very small percentage. As you can tell, it says 0.04%. And so those would be carbon dioxide, and then you have a list of 4 elements along with a compound, methane. And those make up a very, very small percentage of the atmosphere. So we'll focus on the 2 major gases, and then we'll talk about some other things that make up the atmosphere to help in the different processes of heat transfer. So nitrogen, we just said, makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, and it's maintained through the nitrogen cycle. You may have heard about this back in life science. Nitrogen moves from air to the soil, and then plants and animals retrieve it, and then it goes back into the air. So how that works is that bacteria in the soil will chemically change the nitrogen molecule from the air into a compound combined with other types of elements that plants actually are going to use in order to grow. Animals then eat the plants, and those nitrogen compounds are broken down within their bodies, and they're then returned to the soil through waste or decay once an animal dies, and it breaks down back into the soil. Decay releases nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So the cycle continues from there. Then the other element that made up most of the Earth's atmosphere, or at least was a significant amount, was oxygen with 21%. And oxygen's population within the atmosphere is maintained through photosynthesis, which hopefully by now you're pretty much a pro at understanding what photosynthesis is. It's when plants produce the large quantity of oxygen. Animals and bacteria use this oxygen for their life processes. Again, this is what we breathe in. Forest fires and burning of fuels and weathering of rocks also remove oxygen from the air for those processes. The amount produced by the plants is equal to the amount consumed by animal life processes. So this amount is pretty stable. That means it doesn't fluctuate, it doesn't go up and down. It usually remains right at about 21%. So we showed some trace gases, and that involved several elements, and methane and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is what we breathe out, which explains why there is that in the atmosphere. But we also have things that are not gases that compose the atmosphere as well. So the next most important one is water vapor. And this comes from evaporation that is let off from oceans and lakes and streams, and even from the soil. So it causes the invisible gas to form in the air. Plants and animals also release water vapor in their life processes. You may have learned that when plants go through photosynthesis, sometimes as the byproduct of photosynthesis is usually going to be oxygen, but you'll also have some water vapor too, and that process is called transpiration. And then we release water vapor along with carbon dioxide in the process of respiration. So condensation and precipitation remove water vapor from the atmosphere, and these are all things that are mentioned in the water cycle. So hopefully this all sounds familiar to you as well. So the percentage of water vapor varies based on the time of day, the location, and the season. So when we say it varies, that means it changes. It's not completely stable the way we just said that oxygen is. Dry air also has less than 1% of water vapor in it. So if any of you have ever traveled to the western half of the United States, for instance, I've been to Colorado before. I have a cousin that lives in Colorado Springs, and visiting him, I went to Denver and some other places around where he lives, and I was surprised to see how dry the air was there. And one reason is the elevation is much higher than it is over on the eastern half of the United States. And in fact, if any of you are Denver Broncos fans, you may know that they used to play in a stadium called Mile High Stadium. The reason is that the altitude over there is a mile in elevation. Very unique for the area. Now over here, you're probably used to the really humid summers, so that means we have much more moisture in our air. And around the world, moist air could have up to 4% water vapor versus the 1% water vapor over in the drier areas. So if you look over on the right, you'll see the cycle of water vapor and how it travels from where we live on Earth up into the atmosphere and back again. And so it affects what we have understood as the greenhouse effect from when we discussed the heat transfer and behavior of gases as they're in the atmosphere. Ozone is something else we've talked about when we've discussed the stratosphere, and you've taken some notes on that. The ozone is made up of 3 atoms of oxygen, so its compound, or the molecule symbol, would be O3. The oxygen we breathe is made up of 2 atoms, and you've seen that written out as O2 before. The ozone layer's job is to absorb harmful UV radiation from the sun. So this graphic here shows you that there are several different types of UV rays, and based on their different wavelengths gives them their names. So the UVC ray has shorter wavelengths than UVB and UVA. UVA and UVB have longer wavelengths that are still able to get through the ozone layer a little bit, and those are the ones that you'll see on sunscreen where it says that it protects against these ultraviolet rays. You'll usually see those 2 types. UVC you're not going to see, because if you look at the graphic, you can see it doesn't go through the ozone layer or even really touches the stratosphere very well at all. So without ozone, living organisms would be severely damaged by these rays, and human activities have damaged this layer, causing it to weaken. And in fact, you may have heard before about a hole in the ozone layer that's developing over Antarctica. And one reason that scientists have started to predict that that's happening is there's a compound called CFCs, and it's shortened way to say chlorofluorocarbons, which is kind of a tongue twister. They used to be used in air conditioners and refrigerators, and these, as well as exhaust compounds like nitrogen oxide, work in the atmosphere to break down the ozone. So since it's been discovered that these are harmful to the ozone layer, there have been some precautions taken to use different types of chemicals in these things so that what's put out by them is not going to harm the environment as much. So the last thing we'll mention about the composition of the atmosphere are the particulates. And that's a fancy way to say there's tiny solid and liquid particles that exist in the atmosphere. So these come from a lot of things. First of all, as volcanoes erupt, they release lava, but they also release dust into the atmosphere that kind of settles among all the other molecules. Ash also is released from fires. There are microscopic organisms. Mineral particles can be lifted from the soil by winds. There's pollen from plants and particles from meteors, and even crystals of salt left from evaporation of ocean water. So these are all things that have such a low density. That means they're so small, and they're less dense than the gases around them. They're able to continue to float through the atmosphere. So the larger and heavier particles remain in the atmosphere for just a short amount of time before they return to Earth because of gravity pulling them down. But the tiny particles could remain suspended for months or even years before they end up being affected by gravity and being brought back to Earth. So that's just a short overview of what makes up the atmosphere, and hopefully this can help you understand how it all works and how these are all affected by the different layers of the atmosphere and how they can interact through the heat transfer that we reviewed last week. If you have any questions about any of this information, you're curious about something that wasn't mentioned, or if you're confused about anything that was said, please write it down in these notes and be sure that you bring it to class when we're together again, and we can hopefully discuss some of your questions in class. I will see you later.